Good afternoon. Welcome to the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credits sponsored webinar today, In Data We Trust, Supporting Military-Connected Students with National and Local Data Sources. We want to give special thanks to our funders, Lumina Foundation and Strata Education Network. My name is Sarah Appel, and I will be moderating today's webinar, and I am the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credits Manager, and that is an initiative of the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. Questions, please submit those through the chat feature, and follow-up will be done throughout the presentation. So if there's a topic that you specifically have a question for, please put that in the chat box so we can discuss it as it's being discussed at that moment. General overview. The mission of the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit, lovingly known as MCMC, is to facilitate an interstate partnership of 13 states and to translate competencies acquired by veterans through military training and experiences toward college credentials. States exchange information and share best practices in the areas of articulation of credit, certification and licensure, communication and data, and technology. Our project goals are to assist states and post-secondary institutions in aiding military-connected students with critical life transitions from the military to post-secondary education, and then from post-secondary education to civilian employment. Increase post-secondary education completion rates by creating models for the consistent, transparent, and effective awarding of credit for military training and experience that can be scaled regionally and nationally, thereby lowering the cost of education and reducing the time to completion. Establish a strong network of support, communication, documentation, and data collection among institutions and organizations for the purpose of promoting shared interests and tracking the efficacy of efforts to enhance military-connected students' educational success. We have 4 knowledge communities to help us do our work. We have articulation of academic credit, communication and outreach, data systems and technology, and licensure and certification. Today's presenter is Katie Giardello. Katie is a doctoral student in higher education leadership at Western Michigan University. She is also a consultant, Michigan Center for Student Success, and she has been a former MCMC Steering Committee member, and she has so much knowledge and many things to share. So, Katie, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you all for giving up some time on a Tuesday afternoon to talk about data, which is maybe not everyone's favorite topic, although my guess is if you're logged into today's webinar, then it's something that you are interested in and hopefully excited about. So we are going to talk about data, and I like to get this off my chest right off the bat. Some of you will call this word data. I call it data. It's the same thing. We're talking about the same thing, just different linguistics. So as Sarah said, I'm Katie Giardello. I'm pretty familiar with the MCMC initiative. I had the pleasure of working on this initiative from both my home state of Ohio and then my current state of Michigan. And I've recently moved away from my full-time work, and as you heard, I'm consulting on a few projects as well as going to school full-time as a doctoral student. So I am curious to know, are there any other graduate students on the line today? And the way that you can tell me if you're a graduate student is there should be a little hand button in your control panel. If you are in school, raise your hand. Hello, Dominic Barnes, hand raised. Who else is in graduate school right now? Oh, Chelsea Brandon, hello. Rachel Listener, hi there. Cool beans. So I'm not the only one. Sometimes doctoral students feel like we're on an island, and we are not. We are here together. Hi, Susan Moyer, also a doc student or a grad student anyway. Perfect. Well, I have given this presentation a couple of times, and I find that certainly graduate students, especially doctoral level students, are very interested in sources of data on whatever population they're interested in, which today, of course, is the military-connected student population. But I also find that practitioners are really interested in this topic as well. So how many of you are practitioners at a community college and you want to know how you can get better data to inform your efforts? Raise your hand if you work at a community college and you're looking for advice and input on getting data about your students. Okay, not as many. Oh, we do have some community colleges. Awesome. Hi there. I'm going to go ahead and put your hands back down. This is always fun to do at the beginning to see who you're talking with. It's not letting me lower the hand, so maybe Sarah needs to do that. Okay, so how many of you work at a university and you're interested in supporting your own programmatic efforts and getting better data about your military-connected students at your university? Okay, cool. So we're getting more hands raised. Awesome. And then my guess is, because I know some of the names that are on the roster today, that many of you work in state policy environments. You work in the government or in a nonprofit organization that works on behalf of your state or even perhaps your region. So how many of you kind of fall into that category and you're looking for better data to support your efforts or information about the students in your state? Okay, cool. Yeah, that's a fair amount. I'm seeing more hands raised that way. And I'm seeing a lot of friends on the line, so hello to everyone. Okay, cool beans. Well, we can put our hands down now and get started with the objectives for the session. I will tell you up front that I had the opportunity to deliver this session in person at the Student Veterans of America conference earlier this year, and it went really well for all of us. We ended up having a lot of great discussion. It's not as easy to have discussion during a webinar platform, but I'm hoping that we can use the chat function as well as that hand raise button a couple more times throughout the presentation to make sure that we are interacting with one another and that I'm collecting information from all of you as well. So we will do that in a couple of places, including this one here. So I have 3 goals for the session today. One is helping you understand why it's important to have data or outcomes. My guess is most of you know why it's important, but we'll talk briefly about that as we get started. I'm going to go through a few what I call big data sources on military-connected students. This is going to provide more kind of a national representative data picture of military-connected populations. And then the last thing that we're going to cover together this afternoon is to talk with you all about how can you work with folks on your campus to get better local data. And what I hear from people in the military-connected student space is that nobody really feels like their campus has got it quite right yet with regard to collecting data that is accurate and comprehensive about military-connected students. So my guess is that you guys are interested in goals number 2 and 3. My guess is that you're already pretty familiar with the importance of measuring outcomes using data sources. But I will ask now for another hand-raising thing, and thank you for indulging me on this. I would like to get a sense for which goal, 2 or 3, is more important to each of you, or to you all on the line today. So if goal number 2, looking at those big sources of data and knowing how you can pull that data down and query it to support your efforts, is the most important thing you're looking for in today's session, go ahead and raise your hand and let me know that, and I'll give you the chance to do that for goal number 3 as well. Okay, cool. And I'm seeing several of my grad student friends looking for that, and that makes a lot of sense because you might be thinking about research projects that you can use these big data sources for. So we will be going through some examples of that. Because it will be time consuming, I will not be able to show you how to pull down all of the different pieces of data that I'm going to present, but I have incorporated links throughout the presentation so that you'll be able to go and play around with some of those data pools after today's session, and I'm certainly open to having dialogue with you. I don't know that I would call myself an expert, but I have struggled through some of these data sources, so I'm certainly willing to be a resource or a reference as you need it for big data sources, or I can connect you with people who I think are a lot smarter than me who might be able to help you with those kinds of issues as well. So at the very end of the slide deck, you'll get my email address, so you're welcome to contact me through that. So then I would assume that a lot of you are also interested in goal number 3, which is working with folks on your campus to get better local data. So if that's your main priority for today's session, why don't you raise your hand so that I can see that visually as we move forward. You want to be able to work more closely with folks or get better data maybe on your campus. Okay, cool. Some of you voted twice. That's okay. The good news is that these are my goals for the session that I'm presenting, so we're going to cover all 3 of them. Hooray! But it does help me see which areas I should emphasize the most with regard to your interest levels. So that's where we're going. As I said, we're going to start with talking a little bit about some big data sources. And I selected a quote whose name has been, you can't really see the attribution for the quote, but the guy's name is Daniel Keyes, who said you can have data without information, but you cannot have information without data. And I agree with that. And I think oftentimes because we struggle with data capture in the military-connected population world, particularly in higher education, it can be very challenging to make our case because either we have limited data or the population of students who have a military connection on your campuses is slim, and so the data doesn't really help make your case. And we'll talk through how you might be able to get around those issues as we move through the presentation. But I do believe even if it's not the best data, some data is better than none in terms of informing your efforts and what the population is that you're working with or on behalf of, and then how to evaluate results, which is one of the goals of the MCMC network, is figuring out how do we get better data so we can improve student success outcomes for military-connected students, but also evaluate our programmatic efforts. And so I think all of this is really tied together. And I will reiterate what Sarah said at the beginning. If you have a question or a comment, you are welcome to put it in the chat box at any time. And I'm looking at that box right now, and so is Sarah as my moderator. So we will be happy to address those questions or comments live or at any time when I stop and ask you if you have questions. But we're going to dive right in and take a look at some military-specific data portals. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you all so that we can take a look at some of these here live in color, if you will. Okay, so I think I took us away from the slide deck, but we'll go back to it. And I'm not going to open it up in full presenter mode because we're going to step away from it here in just a moment. But it makes sense probably that the federal government connects information on military-connected populations through two different units. And it's surprising to me how many people don't realize that the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs are two separate federal entities, which means that when we're talking about data, we're not talking about the same sources. The DoD has their source of data, which is typically active duty personnel in the armed services, and then the Department of Veterans Affairs has their sources of data, which is typically those people who have moved beyond their service period and are actually veterans or dependents of a veteran. You can get lots of rich data from both sources. They are, of course, different pieces of information, and I have actually already clicked on this September 2018 military personnel by state country, and that's the first item that we're going to look at together. So this actually comes directly from that DoD link. If you had gone to the Manpower Data Center, the DMDC, you would be able to find the link for this particular report embedded in the website. To make things go a little faster for us this afternoon, I've already pulled it up. And what you're looking at here is just sheer numbers of active duty, National Guard, Reserve, and civilian personnel who are currently serving in our armed services. So they split them out by all of the different branches so that you can get a sense of, they call this our strength, our military strength. So this is strength data. And what I like to do is get a frame of reference. So I'm in Michigan, so I'll be using Michigan quite a bit as an example for what we're looking at here. And I'm going to go ahead and enable editing. I like to, when I'm looking at a single line of data, I like to highlight it, particularly on a large spreadsheet like this. I like to go in and actually highlight it so that I don't lose track of my data line. You can also do some other things with Excel with regard to freezing columns so that you don't lose your headers. When you start to digest this information, it can get a little bit unwieldy, as I'm sure you can imagine, because this is a large data source. Okay, so we are looking at the strength of our enlisted personnel in Michigan. And you can see this is folks who are in the active duty and then the National Guard and Reserve. Now in Michigan, some of you know this, but some of you may not, that we do not actually have any active duty bases in our state. So you'll see some differentials when you start to compare. I know Missouri does, so you can see it's a vast difference in the number of enlisted personnel. We can go over here to the totals and it makes it easier to review. In Michigan, we only have about 2,000 enlisted personnel who are in the state as compared to a state with an active duty base like North Carolina, South Carolina, etc. So when you're looking through these data portals, it's really good to kind of have that frame of reference. If you didn't know that about Michigan, you would be like, wow, they're really under-resourced with regard to their enlisted personnel, or even further under-resourced when you start to look, and I know our friends in Minnesota are in the same boat as we are, without an active duty base. But we do have quite the population in the National Guard and Reserve, and you can see over here that starts to even out when you start to look at your National Guard and Reserve units. And then some of you may not even know that we also have civilian DoD employees. So those folks are in this final partition of this report. And you can see that those numbers vary widely as well. I was going to say Maryland jumps out at me, and that makes a lot of sense because my assumption is that many of these people work in the DC area doing government contracting or specific government civilian full-time positions where they're not actually military personnel, but they're civilian military personnel. I know that's probably a little confusing, but it's just the different ways that these folks are classified, and it helps you to understand when you start talking about military-connected populations, it's not as simple as just saying, well, how many enlisted service members are there in your state? We need to be able to understand, are they enlisted in an active duty? Are they enlisted in the National Guard and Reserve and currently deployed or maybe not deployed? But a report like this helps us get a general sense of what the baseline is for this particular, the particular state that you're in and the military-connected population in your state. So again, my intentions are not to go through any of these in great detail, but just to show you sort of a flavor, if you will, of what you can get from some of this data. And I'm trying to go back in now to see, I can't see the chat box anymore, so I'm trying to make sure there were no questions before I move on to my next line. Let me see if I can get back over to it. Here we go. Perfect. Okay, it sounds like somebody had issues with sound, but I'm assuming that you were able to figure that out and that everyone else can hear me because some of you were raising your hands when I asked you to. So usually that's a good cue that folks are hearing okay. We're going to go back over here to the slide deck. And what I just showed you was a single example of a whole lot of different reports that the Department of Defense makes available through their Defense Manpower Data Center, or DMDC. Again, this is just a high level kind of scratching the surface. I showed you a report that I found helpful and that I have used when I've reported on my projects. You heard from Sarah that I consult part-time for the Michigan Center for Student Success, which is a statewide entity in the state of Michigan where I live. Previously, I worked full-time for that organization, and I was doing a lot more direct support to the campuses on initiatives around military-connected students. And so oftentimes the items that I'm showing you here were things that I used in state meetings or in writing reports about our work or in garnering input or interest in our initiatives from stakeholders throughout the state. So that's a little bit of framing for how I've used some of this data.
Hey, Katie, this is
in a similar
Sarah.
Fashion. Hey, Sarah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We still see that you're screen sharing, and we need for you to go back into presenter mode, and then you'll be able to see if there are any chat questions.
Okay. I have the chat questions up. I'm looking at that. And are you all seeing my, my slide deck right now?
I see military-specific data portals.
Perfect. I think things are working as we need them to.
Okay. All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Okay, cool. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the Department of Veterans Affairs data portals, and they actually have several different, the links that I've included here include links to several different data portals that VA sponsors or makes available to the public. And I'm going to go ahead and close out of the presenter view. Whoops. Because I wanted to pull something up on this slide. I'm not going to go through each one of these things, but you can get more detail about data on benefits usage at the first link, the VBA, Veterans Benefit Administration. The VA's open data portal also includes all kinds of different data points. If you're looking to get more into some of these things, I would encourage you to carve out some time to really give yourself room to play and start to look around at what the different options are. I can pull up the National Center for Vets Analysis and Statistics as well. Actually, I do already have that open here. No, I don't. Okay. And then I'm also going to show you the GI Bill comparison tool because some institutions don't know that the VA is publishing data on your institution and on your military-connected populations. And some people have been able to review that data and then realize that it's incorrect and have it corrected at the federal level. So if you aren't familiar with what's being said about you on the GI Bill comparison tool, I would encourage you to check that out, and we're going to go through that here in just a moment. So as I said, this is a great website. This is the third link under the VA list, and it gives you the opportunity to review all kinds of different facts and reports, state summaries, as you can see here, that you can pull up. Utilization is popular for a lot of states, particularly around education beneficiaries, so that you can start to see how, what's the ratio of veterans in your state utilizing their benefits for education versus those that are not. And this actually came up in Michigan when we had someone reviewing the data. So we can just use this. I have not looked at this in a long time, but we can look at this together real quick, and you can see Michigan is down here about halfway, maybe a little bit more than halfway, of usage for education beneficiaries, or education benefits anyway. And when some folks had seen some of these ratios and percentages, they got really alarmed, and they started to think that we weren't doing a very good job in Michigan of educating our veterans. And when I came on the scene, I said, I think there's more to the story. And sure enough, in a few slides, we're going to pull this up and look at it together. But the Census Bureau gives you the opportunity also to review data about the military-connected populations in your state.
Hey,
so
Katie,
when I came on the scene,
Sarah.
I said, well,
would you mind closing your participant feedback up in the left-hand corner? It's kind of covering up some of the information. There we go.
Sorry.
All right.
Okay. All right. We're back in action here. Okay, so when you go to the census page, it will pull up a PDF version of the report that you can download and use as you wish of statistics about veterans in your own state. And as I said, there was some concern when I came on the scene in Michigan about the ratios of veterans in the state and those using education benefits or enrolled in college. But when you start to drill down into the types of veterans that are in your state, you can get a better picture. So I came on the scene and I said, okay, I'm going to look into this a little further, and you can see Michigan over here. Our veterans are highly concentrated, just like our regular population, in the larger parts of our state, although we do have a fair amount of veterans up in the Upper Peninsula. Those single black dots are the veterans that are represented in the census data here. When you scroll down, you get a better picture, and the reports are formatted similarly for all the states. You get a better picture of what era of service your veterans served in your state and what their current educational attainment is. So certainly Michigan lags behind in the number of our veterans with a bachelor's degree or higher when you compare to the national average over here on the black dot. But when you look at the number of veterans enrolled in college nationally versus Michigan, you don't see as much of a discrepancy as what this number might illustrate, or these dots here might illustrate. You might ask yourself, well, why is that? Or you might have already looked ahead and seen that nearly 50% of our veterans in Michigan are 65 or older, and certainly more than 50% are actually 45 and older if you start to add up these bar charts down at the bottom. Michigan has an aging population across the board. It's no different for our veterans. And I always caution people when they start to use just sheer veterans population numbers that you need to know a little bit more about your veteran population. And in Michigan, it would be fairly inappropriate, in my opinion, to be using the baseline number that includes nearly 60% of 45 and older aged veterans when we're starting to talk about our educational attainment, or those that are enrolled in college who may not really be, you don't want them to be part of your denominator because they're not truly a population that would be college bound. So just something to illustrate the importance of kind of understanding your data. And I apologize, we're flipping around. Again, when we did this in person, it was really productive to be able to flip around between the different spots. But if you're finding something that you'd like me to spend more time on, please feel free to go ahead and chat. Put that into the chat box and we can go back to it. But for now, I'm going to go back into the slide deck and show you a few other things. This is additional data that I was able to pull down from the Defense Manpower Data Center. I need to update this, and I just simply haven't had the time to do it because you can see that it's from 2015 and there is more current data. The reason that I like this data report is because when the work that I was doing in Michigan was really specific to articulating academic credit. And when you start to talk about that topic, you need to be able to pull your faculty and administrators or whoever's working with you on an initiative like that along to understand the alignment between military occupations and academic specialties. So this was a slide that I used in almost any presentation or training that I did with faculty, because you had to understand where the service members were coming from. And to understand that you shouldn't expect to see someone coming out of the military with a full English degree completed. If you look at the occupations in the military by group, which are represented on the slide that you're looking at, there is not an occupation for English. although that doesn't mean that there may not have been training or coursework that the service member had completed around that topic. But again, it's important for faculty to make those connections, and sometimes they don't because this is a different environment or a different sector, if you will, than what they're accustomed to in higher education. So I like to point out a few things about this report. One is just to help them understand what kind of training the service members were likely to have received with their different occupations that they held. And then two, to look over in the total enlisted column and see which big numbers jump out. So the very biggest of these numbers is down here, 161,000. Whoops, sorry, I tried to use my arrow there, in vehicle and machinery mechanics. The next highest is 160, which is engineering, science, and tech. The third highest is combat specialty, just about 160,000 enlisted in that combat specialty. Well, there's something we could articulate certainly to vehicle and machinery mechanics in certain technical and occupational programs, more likely at community colleges, but maybe at some of your more technically oriented universities as well. Certainly there are articulations or alignments to be made between engineering and electronic technology programs with regard to the second highest enlisted population. Where we start to run into trouble is that a number of our servicemen and women are trained for combat specialty, which makes a lot of sense when you think about what the military does for our country. However, unless those folks want to go into some sort of like peacekeeping or criminal justice or security, which still is not the same thing as combat specialty, there are not going to be as many opportunities to align that training to traditional academic disciplines. And it's pretty likely that those individuals are going to make a decision to move into a different career field once they've separated from the military. And I think it's really important for folks to understand that going into the work for articulation of credit. So again, something that I like to show to people, not to dissuade them from wanting to step into the work, but to help them understand the baseline and where we're coming from. This data was pulled down from the VA, and I'm showing you this example to help you understand why sometimes it's important to actually aggregate data points. If I had used what came specifically from the VBA, the Veterans Benefits Administration data portal, I only would have had the top few lines here. This VRNE line would not have been present. Some of you already know why, but for those of you that don't, the top lines are all educational benefits. VRNE is technically considered an employment benefit. However, veterans can use it to pursue education and post-secondary training. So in Michigan, this is all situated in Michigan, this particular spreadsheet. The one that you saw prior was a national glimpse of enlisted personnel. This particular spreadsheet is about veterans benefit usage in Michigan. Well, I started in my job in, I think it was 2015. And at that time, there was some concern because you can see in the cell that I'm circling, post 9/11 GI Bill usage had declined. Now, not by a terrible amount, but enough. And then you can see in 2016, post 9/11 GI Bill usage had declined actually fairly significantly. Some of you who are close to this population and understand the data will know that even though the post 9/11 GI Bill came about in the early part of what this chart is showing, there was some retroactivity. There was a period of retroactivity where we got a big boom in the 13 and 14 years of people enrolling with post 9/11 GI Bill usage, and then that kind of sloughed off. So again, it's important to have some contextual understanding of what the data is and what the trends are. Otherwise, people could be very alarmed, and that's what was happening in the last 2 years here in Michigan. The 15 and 16 years, folks were getting really nervous about what does this mean. And I said, you know what, let's look at our VRNE usage. Let's see if we're making up some of those post 9/11 enrollees with VRNE enrollees. It doesn't make up the whole difference, but you can see how adding that particular line of data does help show a more clear picture. Because if we didn't have these 4,200 students here, this would look like about 14,000 military-connected students in Michigan, which would be a drastic drop-off from previous years where it was 20,000 or higher. So again, just giving you some examples of data that I was able to pull out of those sources and utilize to support my projects or to help answer confusing questions that were manifest in the projects that we were considering as a state. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about a few other federal data points, and then we're going to start talking about pulling your data from your own institution and then pulling it all together with how can you use all of these different sources of data to support your work. I already pulled up the state brief from the census. So if you all are not familiar with that resource, I would encourage you to go ahead and click there. If you click the link that I've included in the PowerPoint, it will take you to the page where you can select your particular state. I will also encourage you to look into what IPEDS, or the Integrated Post-Secondary Educational Data System, is collecting from the Department of Education. Another reason why the conversation around data capture for military-connected students becomes a little convoluted is that we have these multiple data sources and they don't always talk. So VA has their portal that tracks veterans benefit users who are using VA benefits. And then USDE, in the last several years, began asking institutions to report data on their military-connected students. Some of that data will match the VA data and some of it doesn't, because some of you will track those students using self-reported procedures or by culling the admissions application questions that you may have about military service. So it's important, again, to know that you're not always comparing apples to apples. But one of the things that IPEDS does is creates a data dictionary on the different fields that they collect. So some of you may not be as comfortable or familiar with IPEDS. It's a really massive database. So if you're not, I would encourage you to start here, where you can start to review what these terms are that they're counting in their data points, and then you can review like what are those things actually referring to. And then the database itself is queryable. Anybody can go in and query institutional data. It is massive and includes a lot of data points. So I would encourage you to spend some time there if you're looking to use that as a big data source. And then my favorite thing, and what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides real quick, is that they also occasionally do, and I skipped ahead already, but this link down at the bottom links you to a full report that IPEDS has produced using the data that institutions have supplied through their regular reporting systems. And the report is there and you're able to download it in full, but I wanted to show you just a few of the graphical data snapshots that were included in this report that I think are interesting, and give you a chance to kind of benchmark your own data against. I will say that this is a little dated as well because it tracks basically pre-recession and then post-recession numbers, and of course pre-9/11, pre-post 9/11 GI Bill, and then post 9/11 GI Bill as well. And you can see what the different numbers are for the different types of military-connected students. Nationally, the number actually hasn't changed a significant amount between the 07, 08, and 11 and 12 years for either undergraduates or graduate students. You do see a little bit of change in the nominal percent points in some of the populations, but primarily we're talking about veterans here. We also have service members who are being tracked who are active duty or in the reserves, still active duty but maybe not deployed at that time. And then we're comparing in this report against the non-military counterparts. And then I think this is interesting as well because it does the same comparison for military and then non-military, either an independent student or a dependent student. Those of you who work on college campuses know that typically a dependent student is a more traditional age student who might still be claimed on their parents' tax return, and that's why they're classifying these as different cohorts. And you can see where they're enrolling. Are they predominantly enrolling in the public two-year sector, which is the blue line here? There was actually, there were more students, more military-connected students in 07, 08 enrolling in two-year schools than there were in 11 and 12. Similarly, more in the four-year public sector, more in the private nonprofit sector, and less in the for-profit sector. I think this is really interesting because then you had the post 9/11 GI Bill and the for-profit sector said, hey, there are some funds that we can pull in, and you can see the very large increase in the for-profit sector enrollment there for the military-connected population. You don't see the same thing maybe here in the non-military independent, so these are adult students. So you do see it a little bit here, but certainly not in the non-military traditional age students. Those populations just aren't as spiked as they are. So something to keep an eye on, and I know some of us have various thoughts on what the for-profit industry has done well and maybe not done so well with our military-connected students. But it's interesting to see those enrollment patterns. And there's a lot of other good data there. Because I'm a grad student and I'm a total geek, I've also included a whole bunch of different references that I think are interesting and I have used to write about this population in different projects that I've done. Where available, I've linked you out to the digital link. You will be more productive looking for these sources if you are logged into a university library system or a community college library system, because you'll probably need access through your institution to get some of these resources. But if you look over this list and you can't find one of those and you want it, I think I have PDF copies of all of these references, and I'd be happy to send them to you after the program. Okay. Two other reports that I use often, and then we'll move into talking more about working with your institutional research folks to get better local data. One is this report that came out of the Institute for Veterans and Military Families at Syracuse University. One of the reasons that I like this report is that it actually asked for the service members' perspectives right from their own mouths. They took a survey on their separation experience. And because education is a part of so many service members' separation plans, I think that the things that those folks reported experiencing or struggling with are really important for us as we serve to better serve this population, or as we work, to better serve this population of students. And I think we owe it to those folks who have, in many cases, the data supports their enrolling in the military in order to be able to enroll in college because of the benefits that come with military service. So I pulled out a couple of the data points that I have used frequently in my presentations or in meetings about this topic. Again, when you talk about articulation of credit, this 55% indicating that they would be switching careers, I think is really important, because there is some level of assumption that you'll be able to pull in a military service member's military training right into their academic program. And while that's true when there's a relationship between those occupations, if they are separating from that military occupation, particularly those combat specialists, they will need to select a new career area. And you may not have the same opportunities to articulate from ACE evaluated credit, and you may need to begin thinking more about competencies in general education requirements or other kinds of opportunities to give credit for those experiences. Of course, I think we would be doing everyone a disservice if we didn't demonstrate the importance of financing and the financial burden on transitioning service members, which a lot of our students have those financial concerns, but when you're accustomed to a fully self-supporting or family-sustaining career wage and lifestyle that you've been living in the military, and then you step away from that, and you're expected to kind of make it on your own and pay for college and everything else that goes along with it. I think we're right to be concerned about making sure that we aren't asking service members to pay more. That's why the articulation of credit is so important to me. If they've done the work, we should recognize the credit and then allow them to utilize their time and their resources most efficiently. And then finally, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Student Veterans of America NVEST report. And I highlight this for two reasons. One, if you're interested in research studies, I think the methodology that they've used to merge several sources of big data in this project are really sophisticated and interesting. And if that's why you're here today, because you want more input on how to design a good research project, I would highly encourage you to reach out to Dr. Chris Cate, who is the PI on this project. He and I have had several really good conversations about what you can and can't do with data merging techniques between VA, and then they use the National Student Clearinghouse, or NSC data. And so Chris has been great in giving advice and loves to bounce ideas around about that kind of stuff, so I would encourage you to consider reaching out to him. What they've done really well with NVEST, not only do I love the project and the volume of data that they've been able to capture, which basically has tracked all of the post-9/11 GI Bill users who have received degrees because of that policy. And the chart that I pulled out actually shows you the different levels of degrees that are being attributed to the post-9/11 GI Bill. This is one of my favorite charts to show. There are really great charts included in this report, and they have a whole infographic that's just visuals. And as long as you attribute the source like I've done at the bottom here, there is no problem in actually showing or showcasing other people's data in the way that I'm doing today. So This is helpful to me because I like to remind people that community colleges are really important to a veteran's trajectory. If you look at the numbers and you start to add them together, the certificates and associates that were received through the post-9/11 GI Bill equal almost as many in volume as the bachelor's degrees that were awarded for this policy. So I think it's important to not to track all of our veterans into the university path, but to consider those that begin at the community college and either end there or decide that they want to transfer, which is a whole different topic when we start talking about the articulation of credit. But I like to showcase that to make sure people are aware that our veterans are choosing multiple options in our higher ed sector. And some of them are getting their master's and then their doctorate degrees as well with their post-9/11 GI Bill. Okay, the other thing that SVA's report does really nicely is identify the program areas where the degrees are earned. So those of you who are looking at articulation initiatives, it can be really helpful to use this data to say, well, look, the highest degrees earned are in business. Maybe we should start with one of our business degrees. I didn't pull that out in this slide, but you can see it when you go to the website. Okay, so now we're going to get talking about your interest in data. And I would like to make this interactive. However, I can appreciate that it'll be a little bit challenging. Oops, my clicking is going crazy. So I'm going to try to ask you if you can tell me what kind of data you feel like you don't have on your campus, that you would like some advice on how do you get your hands on that data. So I'm going to give you guys some time to think about that, and if you want to, I'm sorry if you can read the participant feedback, but I need to be able to read it as well, so I have it pulled up on the screen. But if any of you are willing to participate and tell me what data you feel like you don't have, you can tell me what you do have if you want, but I'm more interested in what you don't have and what units on your campus hold that data. And since nobody has typed in yet, then I'm going to just keep going, but I will keep an eye on it and see if we can get some input from you all. Typically, when you're talking about what kind of data you all have data on VA benefit users. You are required through the certification process to identify and track those students. So certainly your campus should have access to military connected students who are using VA benefits. Most campuses also ask about military service on their admissions application, and the FAFSA, I believe, also includes some questions about military service as well. So you should be able to get data about your own veterans or your own military connected populations on your campuses from one of those three places. The tricky part is that oftentimes different units hold those data differently. So the data that comes from the admissions application is probably in your admissions office, or if you have an enrollment management unit, it's probably in that unit. The data that gets reported to IPEDS about your military connected populations is probably held by your IR or institutional research office, because those folks are typically the ones reporting to IPEDS through the federal reporting requirements. And then the third piece is, hey Sarah.
We have a question for you. How do we find the non-benefit veteran?
Yep, I saw the question. I'll get to that in a minute, Thomas.
Okay.
They're a little more elusive. Yep, they're a little more elusive. They're a little harder to find. And I will ask everyone listening, if you have a great option for how you get those students to self-identify so that you can capture them, maybe you could type that into the chat as well and I can share it with Thomas. That is, in my opinion, one of the most challenging components to this conversation. There are stigmas, many of you know, there are stigmas associated with identifying as a veteran. There are misunderstandings about who is and isn't a veteran. I've talked with folks, in fact, my own husband, who is a veteran and served for 4 years, never saw combat, so he doesn't like to say he's a veteran. He doesn't like to take freebies for veterans because he doesn't feel like he really served because he didn't go to combat, which, again, I disagree with that from a philosophical perspective, but also if you look at the definitions that the federal government sets for veterans, anyone who served and was honorably discharged is typically considered a veteran. However, if they're not using their veterans benefits, the only option you really have to capture those students is to have them self-identify on an admissions application, or perhaps another method, which could be coming to your SCA chapter, or having another option basically for those students to be captured through a self-identification process. That's the best I can give you right now, Thomas, but I'm going to ask if anybody else has great ideas for how they capture that non-benefit using veteran to go ahead and put that into the chat box, and we can add that on there. Yeah, so someone from, I believe, Kansas here is indicating that it's an optional question on their application, so they do have to self-identify. What I have heard from folks who struggle with self-identification is sometimes if you make it apparent why you're asking for that detail, folks might be more apt to self-identify. So the way they got me, I'm not a veteran myself, but because I'm married to a veteran, I'm considered a military-connected student. And as a doctoral student, when I filled out my admissions application, I checked yes because it said very clearly that I might be eligible for scholarship money. And that was motivating to me. So you may be able to play around with the rhetoric that you're using. Whether or not you have a scholarship opportunity, you shouldn't lie to students, of course, but if you do, you could certainly say that that's a reason to collect that information. You could let folks know that they're eligible for some special services, or they might want to join the SBA club or whatever it is that you may have special for your military-connected populations. I have heard that that can be helpful to the self-identification process. Okay, so there's another question about veterans selecting how they're selecting majors, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute. In Minnesota, the question that is asked is, have you or are you serving in the U.S. Armed Forces or Uniformed Services? That gets at who's a veteran because you don't have to identify that for yourself. You can just say yes or no. So I think that I've seen that in a few places, and that is probably helpful to identifying those students. And then Chelsea, I'll get to your question in just a minute about the majors that veterans are choosing. I am not familiar with, other than NVEST and other reports that might look at a specific institution's enrollment patterns, I'm not familiar with another large portal where you can get data on students' majors. NVEST gives you the majors that students graduated with using post-9/11 GI Bill dollars. I think that's a great place to start. Otherwise, if you're supporting a project on your own campus or trying to come up with a research project, you're going to have access to somebody's data on your campus, because you'll need to be able to pull that from probably your student information system, or however your campus actually pulls the data about your student population. Oh, good. Another example or suggestion is that if you can let military-connected populations know they can be eligible to receive priority registration, that is another good way to incentivize that self-identification. That's a great idea. I know some campuses are starting to offer special parking for veterans or military-connected populations, so you could also put that in. Maybe that would be an incentive for folks as well. Okay, so we're going to keep going. I just have a few more slides. I think it's probably intuitive to those of you who work deeply with institutional researchers, or you're well aware of the data kind of fabric on your campus. But some of you may not. If you're in a position that doesn't interface with high-level administrators, you may not be as familiar with institutional researchers. But as you all know, in the accountability era that we live in, there are required reports that have to be submitted at the state and at the federal level. And typically, your institutional research, or institutional effectiveness is sometimes the name of that office, typically those professionals are, we call them affectionately, the data geeks. I don't mean to offend anyone, but they're usually the ones that know how to code data, know what you're asking about, and they're typically going to be folks that you want to pull in if you're looking for a data project on your campus. So one of the things I've gotten feedback on is that a lot of these folks are highly technical professionals, and sometimes you don't know how to ask the right question to make sure that you're getting the right data. Oh, I didn't realize this was a clicky thing. Okay, so to help with that, this handout was developed, and it actually, you'll notice on the left-hand side, it follows the presentation. These links are all the same throughout the handout as they were in the PowerPoint. So this was created so that you could actually take it off the shelf and send it off to folks on your campus that you may want to engage with. And you can see I've linked over here. It's a sideways hyperlink, but this handout itself is actually hyperlinked on this slide. And after today's presentation, you will receive a copy of this as a handout along with the follow-up materials that you'll get. And to help you ask the right questions or know how you want to talk with the folks who are in charge of data on your campus, page 2 gives you some advice on getting the conversation started. and it gives you some suggestions for the types of questions you could ask or things that you want to maybe benchmark to see what's already happening on your campus if you're not very familiar with what's already happening. So we've suggested these, again, just as examples, but you might be able to use that to come up with better questions that fit your context if you have a specific project in mind. But I wanted to make this available to you all in case you want to run with this after today's session. The other thing that I wanted to show you or point out is down on the first page, down at the bottom, there's a link to an article that I'm actually going to pull up right now. I'm terrible with the clicking. I apologize.
Katie, this is Sarah. We've got about, I'm sorry,
Hi,
Katie,
Sarah.
this is Sarah. We've got about 10 minutes left.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Awesome. We're at the end. We're at the end, everyone. You're hanging in there. You're doing a good job. So the source that I wanted to pull up here, again, is at the bottom. It's linked at the bottom of page 1 of this handout. And if you go to chapter 3, look at that. It's already highlighted for my own usage. All right, so we're going to go to chapter 3. If your data geeks start asking you questions about coding that you feel like you can't answer, or if they say we need a new taxonomy for collecting information about our military-connected students, you can say, oh, do I have the thing for you? And what you can offer them is a real taxonomy here. And if you're not familiar, again, you should go to grad school and you'll learn all about taxonomies of data and coding. But essentially what this does is it, currently frozen, but it gives you a code book for how you can most successfully track these students. And again, it's frozen right now, but it's going to come back and it's going to be awesome here in just a moment, and I can show you what that taxonomy looks like. So if you are in a situation where your IR folks feel like they need to make changes on how you're collecting data, I think that this could be a really useful resource. And again, I would encourage you to try to log in through an institutional library login so that you can access that report there. So we are just about done, as you've heard. We've just got a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that I am able to hear your stories or answer your questions. So please utilize the chat feature over the next few minutes. If you want to share a project you're working on or a stumbling block you've come across, I can see if I can offer any input or advice. Chelsea, I do think I answered your question about how how veterans are selecting their majors, and then about job placements. I really think that you would need to use your own trend data at your institution to know what majors that the veterans are using most frequently, or excuse me, enrolling in, not using, most frequently. And you can see here that's actually a data point that I've suggested is, what are the ratios of military-connected students? What's the 5-year trend? And in which academic programs are these students frequently enrolling in? You might be able to find some really good information about your particular region of your state and what job or career or academic programs might be appealing to the veteran student by taking a look at the data that you have on your own campus. And again, these are just ideas that we have here. Does anyone want to share a story or a question or an issue that you've run into? I'm still frozen over here with my PDFs, which is such a bummer. Maybe if I close them down, I can try to pull them up again. While you guys are thinking about anything that you want to share with the group or questions you want to ask. All right, so we'll see if I can pull this up from the link. Who has a success story that they can share where you needed something and you were able to get it from your campus? Does anyone have a good success story? Maybe you had to go through a couple meetings. By the way, take food. If you want to meet with enrollment managers or institutional researchers, I always recommend taking donuts or maybe ordering Panera if you can. All right, so we do have a success story here. Thank you, Shannon, who's working on a federal grant in Kentucky on GAP or accelerated programs for veterans or transitioning service members. So It's a great question. You're probably going to have to engage with your participants. So if there are community colleges in the state, whether you have access to their data from the statewide perspective or you need to get their responses, I would say starting with just the enrollment picture is probably the best way to go so that you can see what kinds of programs they're going into, unless your grant is specific to certain areas, and then you may want to even engage with employers in those certain industries to see if you can get any data from those employers as well. If anyone else wants to share input on working with community colleges, Shannon asked for that, or she said that she would be interested in hearing your input as well. All right, the taxonomy is not coming up. I'm sorry. It's really exciting if you're an institutional researcher to see the taxonomy. Another question, does anyone have data on their military learners, their backgrounds, the credentials they are pursuing, and whether their background is aligned or a pivot? So that's kind of a crowdsourced question. Does anyone have that data? I assume you have some of that data. You can identify your military learners in some fashion. I would assume the enrollment managers could track what credentials they are pursuing, basically in which program. And at the community college level, that would be differentiated by certificate, associate, or maybe a transfer bachelor's path. And then at the university level, typically it's going to be a bachelor's path unless they're enrolling directly into the master's program. And then that question about the pivot, I actually get this question a lot. People want to know what MOS their veterans had pursued and whether or not it's the same as their academic program area. I am not familiar with any campus, but you guys tell me if I'm wrong. I'm not familiar with any campus who's asking student veterans to disclose their MOS on their application. Please tell me if I'm wrong. I'm interested to know if any of your campuses are doing that. What I understand is that if you're looking for that kind of data, it's coming from self-reported detail, or it's a special project, a special research project that has been done about that particular question. But I am not familiar with anyone who's collecting MOS data at intake, which I think is what Michelle was asking about. Okay, well, we have reached the end of our time together. Okay, Michelle's also saying you can also log that on their JST. You can get that occupational data on the JST, which is a good point. I am familiar with some folks who are doing that in their transfer credit databases, but not in the same fashion that I think you're talking about, Michelle, which would be more like of a tracking kind of back and forth. They're not tracking it with the student. They're doing it in their transfer credit databases, but they're not doing it with their student tracking systems. And then Shannon, you make a good point that workforce development units in your state may also have good data to provide, for the example in Kentucky. Oh yeah, you're recognizing that you're using that. And yes, someone asked about the slides. You'll be able to get the slides after today's session along with the recording. And you're also welcome to reach out to me. I've provided my email address. We can connect on Twitter or LinkedIn. And you might see me around town. I go to conferences sometimes. And I'm very happy to support other scholars' efforts around kind of cracking this nut. This military-connected student population landscape, I think, is really important, and not enough people are paying attention to it. Any final questions before we close down here with a couple minutes left? Hopefully this was helpful. It's a big topic to cover, and so I felt like I was just giving you little flavors, but hopefully you got some resources that you can follow up on and at least something to go from to help with what you're doing at your home campuses. Sarah, is there anything else you want to share?
Thanks, Katie. You've done a super job on a very difficult subject that spans so many different resources. Just coming up, we just want to let you know that all of the past webinars that we've done here with MCMC are available on our YouTube channel. And if you have any additional information, questions, you can see our address down at the bottom. And like Katie, if you want to join us for the conversation, please contribute your successes, and we'd love to share them on our Facebook page. We always love to share good information with other folks. Again, my name is Sarah Appel, and I'm the manager of the Multi-State Collaborative on Military Credit here at the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.